Hello everybody, welcome back to the channel. In this video, we are going to be covering Sass. Now, Sass is a substitute for CSS. You can use Sass instead of CSS to style your elements. And I really like Sass because out of the box, you get a bunch of things that you wouldn't get with CSS. So Sass has a bunch of things like variables, mixins, nesting, all these cool things that you don't get with just plain old vanilla CSS. And the reason why this is so important is because when you have large scale applications, you need a way to organize your style sheets. And the best way to do that is to use Sass. Now, Sass, I said, was a substitute to CSS. It's not really a substitute. Sass is a pre-compiler. So what it does is it provides a bunch of cool syntax, but ultimately it compiles down to CSS. So if we go over here to this diagram, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be writing Sass, and we're going to be using all of the cool features that Sass has, but at the end of the day, the browser cannot read Sass code. It can only read CSS code. So what ultimately is going to happen is we write the Sass, we make use of these really cool features that we don't get with just plain old CSS, but at the end, it gets compiled down to CSS. And then the browser can read that CSS. And that's really what we want. We don't want our browser to use Sass. We just want to use Sass for development purposes, make use of all these handy features, and then just compile it down to CSS. And that is Sass. Now, if you want to follow along, what I want you to do is just open up Visual Studio Code. That's really all you have to do. You have to do nothing else. And open up a folder in Visual Studio Code and just create an index.html file. And then in there, just do doc just to get the boilerplate index.html. And then what I want you to do is to download two extensions in VS Code. And this is why this has to be VS Code, unless these extensions exist in other code editors. Go over here. I want you to download this one, Live Sass Compiler. And what this is going to do is it's going to compile our Sass in a live browser reload, as it says over here. So as soon as we write Sass, what it's going to do is it's going to compile it to CSS. And we need this because, again, our browser, it can't understand Sass. We're only going to be using Sass for development purposes. Now, another thing I want you to download is Live Server. And what this is going to do is allow us to open up our HTML in a live server and view it. And as we make changes, it will update automatically. So for instance, when you download these two extensions, what you can do is you can go to your HTML, right click on it, and then you should see an option called Open with Live Server. So you can click on that, and then it should trigger you to, let me just open that in Chrome. It should go to localhost 5500, whatever it is, doesn't matter. You can just copy it, and you can see here I have this empty HTML file. Now, if I were to make a change, let's add an H1, just say hello. You can see here that I get this hello. Let me just quickly zoom in. And you can see here that we get this hello. And this is pretty nifty because I really don't want to continuously reload the page in order to see these updates. So this is a lot better. So those are the two extensions. Just really all you need to have is just VS Code and those two extensions installed, and you'll be able to learn Sass very easily with that. So I'll see you guys in the next section. In this video, we are going to be talking about Sass variables. Now, variables is not something specific to Sass. We can utilize variables with CSS, but they're far easier to use with Sass. So in this section, we are going to be talking about how to use variables and why we should use variables and what pain points they alleviate. So let's go ahead and let's get right into it. So over here we have our index.js file, and you can see here that we have our page and it says hello. So what I can do right now is let's just get rid of this and let's change this to some lorem ipsum. Let's say we want to create a website that displays a bunch of different texts actually the texts are the same, but within different fonts. And we just want to display every single font. So we want to display some sort of font gallery. So let's go ahead and we want to go ahead and let's say lorem 15, so we can get 15 random lorem ipsum names or words. And now if we go over here and it's not refreshing, let's just press refresh. Seems like the connection has died out, so we can just open up our connection again. And now if we close this, we go back, the whole, there we go, let's fix that up. So now if we go here, okay, we should see this, and let me just zoom a little bit out. I think that should be visible for you guys. Okay, cool. So this is the first font that we want to display, but we want to style it a little bit. Let's say for each font, we want a different color. So let's just style it a little bit. So typically when we want to style something, we would create a CSS file and then link it to a particular HTML element. But we're working with Sass. So instead of creating a CSS file, we're going to create a Sass file. So let's just create a directory where we'll house all of our styles. And in here, instead of creating a styles.css, we're going to create a styles.sass. Now we have two options. We can either use Sass or SCSS. Typically, SCSS is used. At the end of the day, it's really just Sass. We get all the same features, but the way we syntactically do things is a little bit different. And I prefer SCSS, and I pretty much see SCSS used commonly throughout every single project. Just to quickly illustrate the difference between them, let's go over here and let's go to the documentation. If you go to Learn Sass, I believe it's in Learn Sass. Okay, let me just quickly zoom in. This is a perfect example. So over here, you can see by default, it shows you the SCSS. And you can see here that we have our element that we want to, or our selector. So over here, we want to style the body. And then just like Sass, we have curly brackets, and then, or sorry, just like CSS, we have curly brackets, and then we have our styles within that. That's how we do it with SCSS. But with Sass, we do it a little bit differently. We don't have any curly brackets and we rely on indentation. I personally don't like that, and that's really the only difference between the two. Other than that, they're exactly the same. So I prefer to use SCSS. All right, so I hope that clears that up. They're really the same at the end of the day, your choice. So let's go over here and let's give this a class of text. So I'm gonna give this a class of text. And what I want to do is I want to style this text, of course. So let's go over here and let's style it. Now, how do we want to style it? Of course, we have to select the element. Let's select it by class. And now we want to style it. So let's say we want the color to be green. We also want the font size. Let's say our designer wants a very specific font size, 2.43 rems, very specific. And they want to display for this specific text font family of, I'm just going to pick one of these default. Let's do Georgia times New Rome and then times Sheriff. So if I were to save this and go back, nothing has changed. And there's two reasons for this. The first reason, of course, I haven't linked this to the HTML. And the second reason is I have to compile this down to CSS. The browser can't read this. Now this looks like normal CSS, and you can utilize normal CSS practices in a Sass file completely fine. But if we want to utilize this, we have to compile it down to CSS regardless. So at the end of the day, we should have something that's called styles.css, not styles.scss. So how do we do that? Well, that's where we utilize the extension that we installed, the live Sass compiler. So now what we can do is we can just click on watch Sass. So you should see this over here, watch Sass. And right now it's going to watch the Sass files. And if you look at the directory, let me just zoom in a little bit. If you look at this directory, you should see .scss, but you should also see styles.css, as well as styles.scss.map. You really don't have to worry about this. This is just mapping the two together. But you can see that this got compiled down to just regular CSS. Now this looks exactly the same, and it is exactly the same. We just have a text and we have color, font size, and font family. So again, you can utilize normal CSS practices with Sass, but Sass of course gives you additional things that you cannot do with CSS. So now what we can do is we can go over here and we can add a link tag. So let's add a link tag, and we're going to say, yes, this is a style sheet, and we're going to move into the styles directory, and we're going to use the CSS file. So now if we were to save this, you can see that we have our text. Okay, cool. So now we want to display more text with different fonts. So let's just go ahead and just copy this 5 times. And let's say that we have over here 2, 3, 4, and 5. And we want to style this in different ways. So let's go ahead and let's just go into our Sass file and let's create those styles. So over here we're going to have 2, 3, and then 4, and then 5. So if we were to save this, this is going to again compile the CSS over here, and we should see all this change. Now what we want to do is we want to change the color for some of them, just so that they're not all the same color. So let's say this one is a little bit orange, and we're gonna say that this one, fantasy. We want to display the fantasy font family for this one. This one we'll say is yellow, and let's say that this one is, let's go with cursive. That one seems kind of cool. Let's go with that. And then over here, let's say that this one's aqua, and this one will say monospace. And then over here, let's just change this to, I don't know, red. And let's give this one whatever this is. So let's save that. And oops, I did this in the CSS file. I should have got rid of that. Okay. let's actually just copy this and let's just paste it in the Sass file. It's exactly the same styles anyways, so let's save that. Should get compiled down anyways, even though I already did it. And now you should see all these text. Let me just zoom out. So now over here we're displaying all our text. We have a nice website that showcases all of these different fonts. All right, so that's cool. But right now there's just a tad bit of a problem. Let's go to our Sass and let's look at the code over here. So over here we have color, and the color seems different for every single one. And then similarly we have font family, which is of course different for every single one. But the size, the font size is consistent throughout every single element. It's always 2.43. Now, when something is consistent throughout many elements and we go ahead and just hard code it out, that could be very problematic. And let me tell you why. Right now, our developer or our designer says, hey, I want 2.43 rems for the font size. But maybe, I don't know, a week from now, he's like, you know what? I really don't like that font size. It doesn't really work. I think it needs to be 4.45 or actually let's just say 3 rems just so we can see it. Now, in order to make that change, we have to go through every single element and change it. So we'd have to go here, 3, here, 3, here, 3. And if we have multiple style sheets and we have a very large application, for one, we can miss things. And for two, this is very, very tedious. So that is not great. That's not a good option. So how do we fix this? Well, one way we can fix this is by having variables. So if this is a very common thing, then what we can do is we can have variables. And in Sass, we can use variables like this. Let me just unindent this a little bit. I made it worse. There we go. So in Sass, we can utilize variables like so. So at the top of the file, what we can do is we can say $, and over here we're assigning the variable name. We can say base font size. So we can call it whatever it is that we want. And then over here, whatever style we want to save that variable as. So over here, we can just say 2.43 rems. So now what we can do is copy this and just paste it in here very, very easily. So you can just copy that and just paste it in here. And that way, every single text is using this font size. And to prove it to you, well, nothing has changed. And even if I refresh, nothing has changed. And to even more further prove it to you, if you go to the CSS, it has transpiled or compiled down to this over here. So it looks exactly the same. And now if your designer is like, yeah, I really need this to be a little bit bigger. I need it to be 2.75. We don't have to go through every single one. Now what we can do is you can just change the variable to 2.75, and then you can see it has gotten a little bit bigger. And over here in the CSS, you can see every single one is 2.75. And that right there is the power of variables. Now, typically what I like to do is inside of the styles directory, I like to create a variables.css. And then in here, I like to house all the variables. So I can get this variable and I can paste that variable in here. And now we have an error. So the error is, actually we don't have an error. Let's get rid of that. Now the error is, I believe we should have an error. Let's quickly save this. Okay, I don't believe it's gonna show, but if it was a React application, it would show. Actually here, we have an error. It's saying that, hey, this is not defined. And the reason why it's defined is because we define it in a completely different style sheet. So in the variables .sass file. So to get this style sheet and everything inside it right over here, all we have to do is utilize the @import. So over here, we're just importing everything within this style sheet. So we can say @import, and we want to import everything from the variables.sass. And so now we can utilize this variable. So we can save this, and now we shouldn't have that error anymore. And if I were to change this back to 4.3, notice everything's 2.7 or 2.75, yes. And I were to save that in just a little bit. I guess it's not changing, which is surprising. Let's save that. It says success. Okay, it took some time, but you can see everything has changed. All right, cool. And that is pretty much it. That is really all you have to know with variables. Variables are very neat, especially when we have something very, very consistent. And I highly recommend using them whenever possible because they really organize your style sheets. So that is variables. In the next section, we're going to talk about mixins, which is another form of a variable, but it allows us to store multiple different classes. So I'll get to that in the next section. In this section, we are going to be talking about a very special Sass feature known as Mixins. And to introduce Mixins, let's talk about a potential problem that could arise. So let's say that we have our website here, our designer likes it, but we need some improvements. For instance, we need a margin between each font. So we need a margin between each one, and we need maybe a little bit of padding so that not everything is squished to the end of the screen. So over here, our designer is like, hey, I want you to add for each text, I want you to add a margin bottom of, let's say 5 rems. So you can go ahead and you can say, okay, margin bottom of 5 rems. Now this is going to be consistent throughout every single one. So you could store this as a variable if you want to. But let's say that you already did that. I'm not going to do it here, but let's say you already did this. There's still another problem that could arise. So over here, you know what, let's just go ahead and just do it quickly. So let's say $, and we can say just margin font or margin bottom font, and we can say 5 rems. So we go ahead, we do the good thing, we add our variable inside of our variable.sass file, And then we have our variable over here. So if we were to save this, we should see, if we refresh, we should see it. Okay, cool. But there's still a little bit of a problem here. I still have to copy and paste every little thing in here. This is very annoying and very problematic. So now let's say that, okay, now we also want to include padding. Well, again, we would have to do the exact same thing. For this one, I'm just not gonna add the variables, but you could if you want, if they're consistent. We're gonna say 3 rem of padding, and then we're gonna have to copy every single one. Super, super annoying. Okay, so how do we fix this? Well, we can fix this by grouping common styles together with mixins and then giving them to a specific selector. So let me just show you what I mean. So over here, what are the common styles? Well, I mean, everything at this point is common, but let's just focus on the ones that are consistent. We can really just utilize everything, but again, let's just focus on the ones that are consistent. So for instance, let's focus on the font size is always consistent. And let's also focus on the margin bottom, and I missed the padding for this one, so let's add the padding here. So let's go ahead and let's utilize this. So in here, we can say @mixin, and we can call this mixin, let's call it base text. And we're going to call this base text styles because, well, this is going to house a bunch of different styles. And so in here, we can have a bunch of different styles. For instance, we can have the font size. We could also have the margin, and we can also have the padding. So we can put that in there. And now what we can do with this mixin is, instead of having all these redundancies, we can just get rid of them. And at the very top, what we can say is @include. And this basically, what this does is it allows us to include a specific mixin. And the mixin we want to include is this one. So we say, hey, we want to include the styles of this mixin. So if I were to save this, you can see these styles remain the same. And let me just quickly just change this and say background color, just so it can really illustrate this. Background color of aqua. So now if I were to go to the style sheet, you can see here that I get background color of aqua, and this is the only one that gets that style. So you can see that this is a lot better. So now what we can do, instead of utilizing all these classes, you can see all these redundant classes, we can just include this mixin. So we can get rid of the font size because that's already within the mixin, as well as the margin and the padding. Just include the mixin. Let's get rid of the font size because everything is consistent. Put in the mixin. Let's get rid of that. Let's get rid of that. And let's put in the mixin. And then lastly, let's get rid of the font size here. And let's just put in the mixin, and notice that nothing will change. Absolutely nothing changes. It remains exactly the same. And now if you want to add, if your designer says, hey, we need a border around each thing, you don't have to go through every single one. All you have to do is just say border solid black. And then now we have a border around every single element, which is really cool. Of course, the border is hideous, so let's get rid of it. But that is the power of mixins. And what's great about mixins is they really feel like programming languages. And there's so many different cool things that you can use. Instead of styling, you can really programmatically start picking the styles that you want. And let me show you what I mean by that. Now, over here you can see that the color is the same, but it is always, we still have the color property, of course, but the value is different. We can actually include this in the mixin if we want to, but you might say, well, this is always going to be consistent. The values are always going to be consistent. How are we going to have these dynamic colors? Well, what we can do, just like a programming function, we can have variables. And over here, we can say $, and then color. So over here, what we can do is say, hey, the color is whatever we pass in to the parameter. So the color, the property color is going to be whatever we pass in over here. So now what we can do is instead of just invoking this over here, or instead of just using it, we can invoke it like a function. And over here we can say green. So now if we were to get rid of this and we were to, we can also pass in, we can pass in any style that we want. So any style value that we want. So we can pass that in if we want to. Let's get rid of this. And we can of course do the exact same thing with the font family. I'm not going to do that, but we could also do that with the font family. Sorry, what was the color of this again? Let's copy that. Oops. Let's get rid of this. Let's pass that in. Let's copy this and get rid of that. And let's pass that in. And let's go over here and we can pass, oops, I forgot to get the right color, this red color, and we can pass this in. All right, cool. And this is exactly the same. You can see the colors are exactly what they were before. And we pass those colors in to this Mixin. All right, so let's talk about something else, some really cool thing that we can do with Mixins. So we can do, what we can do also is, let's say we want to provide the background color. And we only want to show a different background color for certain texts that we feel like it. So what we could do if we want to is we could say that we want the background color. So we want the background color. And what we could potentially do is say, instead of passing it in, if we want the background color to be transparent for the ones that we don't pass in the parameter for, what we can do is, you know what, let's just change this to background color because this is just a variable. What we can do is we can say that by default, the styles is transparent. So now what we can do is, of course, over here, we can say background color, and then we can say $ background color is this one. And by default, if I were to save this, you can see, let's just go back. Hopefully it compiles. It takes some time, but you can see by default, everything is transparent. So now we don't see anything. But if we want to, what we can do is we can go to, let's say, this third one, and we can say yellow, and I spelled yellow wrong, yellow. We can save this, and now you can see that this is yellow. Now, I don't really like this. The reason why I don't like this is because in our CSS, we have this background color. And it's always transparent. And I really don't like this extra style that we have here. We really don't need this. By default, if we have a background, if we don't specify a background color, it will be transparent. I don't really like specifying this style. So what we can do, and this is what I mean about how Mixins can really be functions, is we can have logic in here as well. So we can say at if, so we can say if the $ background color, so if the $ background color, and over here we can say is not equal to transparent. So if it's not equal to transparent, then we want to create this style. So then we want to create it. But if it is equal to transparent, which is what it is by default, then we don't want to create this style at all. So now over here you can see in the styles, we don't have the background color. We don't have the background color. We only have the background color over here is where we specified it. That's amazing. Like this is real. This is programming where we have if statements and we're passing parameters. This is really what's done in JavaScript or Ruby or C. And we're doing that with CSS, which is pretty nuts. So we can do that as well. Now, one really cool thing that I also want to show is we can also define properties, which is pretty nuts. So over here, what we can do is we can say $property. So we can say property, and by default, let's just say, I don't know if we can just say nothing. Let's just say, this one's tough. I'm trying to think of a thing that, yeah, we'll just say nothing. Or null. How about that? So we'll say null by default. And then over here, we can also provide a value. So we can provide a value. And similarly, we'll just give this a default value of null. So now over here, let's just do the @if, and then we can say here if $property equals null, then we don't want to do anything. So let's just go here, and we don't want to do anything. Or actually, if it's not equal to null, we want to do something. So now what we can do is we can say that we want to use this property. And remember, the property is something like font size, margin bottom, padding. And so we want to utilize this property. To do that, we can do $, and we can say $property. And we can say we want this property and we want $this value. So over here, what we can do, let's just go ahead and save this. Make sure that we don't have any errors. And we don't. Everything is a success. Terrific. But now let's go over here and let's say we also want to specify a border. So we can say here this is a border. So this is the property matching this property variable over here. So the border. And then we want the border to be 0.2 rem, 0.2 rem, solid black. That's the value. So let's save this and let's go here, and cool. So we can also define properties, and you can see that that's the property right there. Of course, you can also change the property. You can, I don't know, make this to border radius, and you can go over here and you can say 5 rems is the value. So now it's kind of circular. I don't like this, so let's just go back to what we had before. So there's a lot of cool things that you can do with Mixins. And I highly suggest also with Mixins, put these in their own file. You don't want to put them inside of the style sheet where you're selecting the elements and styling them. What you want to do is you want to create some sort of mixins.scss. Just save that there. And then in here, just do @import, and you want to import everything in the mixins.scss. Same exact thing. And what's cool about this is if you go to the CSS, it just looks like normal CSS. And then over here, you can see that we have the border. But over here, there's a lot more complexity and there's a lot more logic and a lot more cool things that we can do with it. All right, so that is Mixins. I hope that explains it. In the next section, we're going to be talking about, of course, some other really cool Sass features. In this section, we're going to be talking about another very important Sass concept known as nesting. Now again, to do this, to illustrate the importance of nesting, let's just look at a real-life example. So inside of our index.html, what I want to do is I want to copy this header, and what I want to do is I want to get rid of the class styles. So over here, let's just copy it, and I want to paste it in twice. So we should see something that looks like this. So we should have these nice styles over here, and then right over here, we shouldn't have any styles. Okay, cool. Now what I also want to do is I want to wrap these two h1 elements inside of a parent element. The first one is just going to be a regular div element. So over here, let's have a div. Oops, not all capital case. Let's have a div, and I'm going to wrap it inside of that div. Over here, I'm going to use maybe something more semantic. Let's say a section. So a section element, and I'm going to wrap that inside of the section element. Now what I want to do is I want to style each one of these without the use of any classes. How do we do that? Well, we could use just the h1 selector, but the problem with that is the styles is going to apply to every single h1, including these two. So you might be thinking, okay, well, what we can do is, because we can look at the parent and then we can style the child within that parent. So for example, we can do something like div, and then we can say h1. So the h1 inside of the div, in this case, there's really only just one. We want to style this. So we can say here, and we can copy this over here. We can change the color to something else if we want to. Let's change it to purple. And let's change the font family to Apple system. I've never seen that before. Let's see what that looks like. So we could do this, and that way we can also do the exact same thing, but this time instead of the header, what we can do is we can say we want to get the H1 inside of the section. Similarly over here, what we can do is we can change the color, and we can also change the font family. Let's just pick one. Let's pick Gil, whatever this color is, or font family is. So if we save this, now if we go over here, you can see everything works perfectly. And well, this is awesome. This is terrific. But there's actually a better way of doing this with Sass. Instead of having the div element and then whatever is underneath it, this can be a little bit problematic. And the reason why this approach is problematic is, what if over here we have another one, and this is an H2, for instance. And now what we want to do is we also want to style this H2. We would have to create a div H2. Well, there has to be an easier way to do this. And for this, let me just say that the opacity is 0.2 rems. So let's go ahead and save that. And we should see this somewhere over here. Right here, this one. Okay, so this is, again, this is kind of annoying. Very, very repetitive. With Sass, we really don't have to do it this way because we have nesting. So we can accomplish this exact same thing by doing something like this. So we can say div, and over here we can pretend like, hey, we have our brackets, like we're gonna style the div. But then over here we can specify another child element. So we can say H1. And then within the H1, we can have all of the H1 styles. So within the H1, we can have all of the H1 styles. And this achieves the exact same thing as this. But now what's great about it is also in here, we can style the H2. And over here, we can save this and copy that in here. And now if I were to get rid of this, and notice I didn't save yet. So let me just quickly just show you how the styles look right now. So over here, we have our H1 and our H2. And now over here, if I were to save this and refresh, these styles stay exactly the same. Similarly over here, it's exactly the same. But this is really, really cool and a very important feature, especially when you want to use this kind of selecting elements by looking at the parent. And this is a really good way to organize your styles. And of course, you can nest it however much you want. So again, let's say over here inside of the HTML, we have over here a span element. So oops, we have this, I didn't cut this. Let's say a span element, and we want this span element. So in here, we can also specify another element called span, and over here we can say font size of, let's say 20 rems. So just one letter is humongous, and this works perfectly okay. So over here again in the style sheet, you can see that at the end of the day, it looks something like this. But this is just a cleaner, let's get rid of all these other files. This is a much cleaner way of doing it. And especially when you're using the BEM methodology, if you don't, it's a very, very common methodology. It's not really a language or anything. It's just the methodology of writing class names. This is very, very useful, this kind of nesting. All right, so that is pretty much it, really. That's all we really have to do. Let's just get rid of that span. We don't really need that. Actually, I'll leave it in there. We're not styling it. Let's just get rid of this H2. And in here, let's just talk about something really cool that we can do with this. And right now, this might not seem as practical. Obviously, when your application gets a lot bigger, this is very practical. But right now, let's say that what we want to do is we want to, once we hover over this H1 in this section element, what we want to do is we want to change the background color. Now, the way that we're doing it right now, what we would have to do in normal CSS is we would have this, and then we would say, hey, when we hover, I believe it's only one. So when we hover, we want to change the background color to aqua. Okay. You can see pretty, I mean, this is pretty annoying. So let's just hover over this. You can see the background color gets changed to aqua. Pretty annoying. Really don't like this. So let's just use nesting instead. So to do this, what we can do is, first of all, let's say in here, we're going to want to nest this in an H1. And now inside of the H1, we want to use this hover. Now the thing is if we nest it, the way that we're nesting this over here is it's going to say section and then space H1. As you see, let me just get rid of this. As you see right over here, it's going to be section space H1. But what we want is we want section space H1 and then colon without any space and then hover. So the problem with this over here is if we want to also nest the hover, we say hover, and then we say background color of aqua. The issue with that is you can see we get this space. Now to remove the space, all we have to do is provide the and. And what this does is says, hey, we want to attach this to this parent element. So now what we can do is save that. And you should see now we have no space. And now this is a very, very practical and cool example that we can utilize. And of course, when we go over this, we can hover. All right, so I think that is pretty much it for nesting. Nesting is a really, really cool and important feature in Sass. And I hope this section really explained that. And in the next sections, again, we're going to be dealing with other cool features. I'll see you then. Wow, is Sass a programming language? Now we're talking about inheritance. Well, let's talk about that and how we can use inheritance to really easily style our elements. So over here, I introduced two new elements. I introduced the div, and I've also introduced the section element. Now, let's say that what we want to do is we want to style these elements. So let's go ahead and let's say class. We're going to call this, let's say that we have different class names for these. Now, at the end of the day, this seems kind of redundant, but let's just have different class names. So over here, we're going to say div container. And then over here, we're going to say that this is a section container. Now, alternatively, what we could most definitely do is style things over here. And I don't want to do that because it's just, there's a lot going on here. And I just want to really showcase inheritance at the way that it works, which is really cool. And to do that, I think if I did it within the section or div element, because we have all this nesting, it might take away from that. So what we're going to do is we're just going to use these class names. So let's go ahead and what we want to do is we want to style the div container. So we want to style the div container, and we want to say that the border is, we want to give it a border, let's say, of solid black. And let's see what else here. What else could we give this? Let's just make it really ugly. Let's also give it a border radius of 50%. Okay, this is hideous. And let's also give it a box shadow of let's give it a box shadow of 1 rem or 0.1 rem, 0.1 rem, and then let's just say 1 rem of black. Let's also make the border radius not that hideous. So let's just say 1 rem instead. Okay, that looks still kind of terrible. Let's just give this. Let's just make this more. Give it an opacity a little bit over here. Okay, cool. So now let's say that inside of our section container, we have a little bit of styles as well here. So let's say we have, let's say, I'm really trying to think of different styles for this. Let's come on, think. Let's say the background color is just this color over here, and maybe we have a text shadow of 0.1 rem, 0.1 rem. This just gives it a shadow, and let's just say black. So over here we have this shadow here as well. It's kind of ugly, but we also want to have these styles as well in this container. So we want to have the border as well as the border radius as well as the box shadow. So one alternative we could do is just go ahead and just copy and paste that. But again, we have this redundant code. Now what we could do is, we already talked about this, we could place this in a Mixin. But I like to use Mixins if we are using many elements that use that block of styles. Let's say for this example, really the only two elements that are going to be using these styles are these two, the section container and the div container. But no other element is using this. And I think that's kind of a waste of using Mixins. Mixins are more typically used when we're consistently using those styles across multiple elements. Now over here, 2 elements, it's kind of a hassle to use the Mixin, and we're gonna have to, it's just a lot of work. So what we can do instead is we can say, hey, we want this class or this element to inherit the styles of this element instead. So, and we can do that extremely easily with the @extends keyword. So over here we can say @extends, and we want to extend this selector over here. So basically what this is doing is it's saying, hey, we want all of the classes over here plus these classes. And really all this is doing is inheriting these classes, and as well, of course, it has its own classes as well. So now what we can do is, you can see we have, it's really not spaced out because we don't have any margins, but you can see that it's perfect. It works completely fine, and it has inherited it. So this is another approach if you want to kind of just save on code and make things a lot easier. And now, of course, if I were to add another thing, so we can say, I don't know, I never know what to do here. Let's see, I'm just putting like random things. Let's say font weight, that works. Let's say 900, that's also inherited over here as well. I don't think that was even shown. Maybe if I did 100. The font weight is not really being shown. Let's pick something else. Font styles, let's pick italic. So you can see here, this is italic, and then also this is italic. We can always, I don't think I mentioned this, we can always override things if we don't want it. We can say font styles, we can say normal or oblique. Let's just say oblique for this one. And you can see here that, oh, you know what, let's just say normal. I'm not sure if oblique is similar to italic. You can see here that it's back to normal. All right, so that is pretty much it. In the last section, we're going to be talking about operators. In this section, we are going to be talking about operators. And I really like this because it's super, super cool to utilize. So, for example, let's say that right now I created this element over here, this text 6. And what I want it to be is, I want to define the width of this in percentage. I want to define the width of this in percentage. And I know the whole viewport width, let's say, for example, is 1000 pixels, or actually, let's make this a little bit more complicated. Let's say that the full viewport width, if you don't know what a viewport is, it's the width from the beginning over here to the end. So from the far left to the far right. Let's say it's something like, let's say 1264 pixels. So that is the full viewport width. So over here, I created this h1 element, gave it the class of a text 6, and I also have this over here. I just created the @include, gave it a different color and a different font family, and I want to specify its width. Now I know that the width is, again, the max width is 2.43 pixels. Now, what I want to do is I want to specify this width in percentage. So what I can do, and I can't really do this in Sass, is first I have to figure out, okay, how long do I want this to be? What does the width have to be? Let's say I want the width to be 433 pixels. So I want it to be 433 pixels. But again, I want to specify the width in percentage. So what I can do is, instead of doing this calculation in a calculator and figuring out the percentage, I can just let Sass figure it out. So I can say, hey, I want to divide this many pixels by this many pixels, and then I want to multiply it by 100%. So if I were to save this, you can see here that the width is appropriate. And if I were to go to the styles, you can see that the width has been calculated. Really cool. And we can utilize this with Mixins if we want to, if we can actually pass in the width as a parameter. We can also, it doesn't have to be, we can also put this in parentheses, and we can use just normal bed mass. So you can say something like this. Maybe over here we can have another set of parentheses, and we can say this plus 20 pixels divided by this. And maybe we can also multiply this by 1.2 pixels. So we can do all kinds of wonky things. Of course, we can also subtract as well. So we can subtract, I don't know, 2 pixels here. And then it will recalculate the width, and you can see everything is fine. So we can use these operators as well, which is really cool. All right, so that is pretty much it for Sass. Thank you for watching this tutorial. I hope you learned a lot, and now you can utilize Sass in your own projects.